Well, good morning. Today, it's all things chainsaws. I'm going to take a little bit of time and answer some questions or respond to some of the comments or advice or suggestions that I get on the channel. I got a lot of them. In fact, I wrote them down. So hey, I just wanted to talk about a number of random things that have to do with the chainsaw, what you see on the channel, how I'm slowly over time learning how to use the chainsaw, hopefully a little bit better over time, and kind of my background on it so that you folks watching understand that, and I know I say this a lot, I am not accredited or certified. I've never been on a chainsaw course, and of course I'm no expert. I think mainly I'm kind of just like most of you folks, short of those that are loggers or forester arborists or people that have been doing it for decades. I benefit, of course, from the wisdom or the experience of my neighbors, as well as a lot of you good folks. And that includes some of the things that they've taught me that are right, and perhaps some of the habits that they've learned over decades working in rural Ontario or rural Canada. So I absolutely encourage comments, suggestions, whether it's positive, advice, suggestions, constructive feedback, or criticism. Feel free to make this an interactive video as you go through it. I'm just going to talk about things from my own perspective, my own opinions or views or experience, but I welcome yours. So let's get at it. So let's talk about warming up the saw. A lot of differing opinions on it, but here's what my chainsaw shop tells me. Ron and his family at the chainsaw clinic, been around since the 1950s, family owned. He knows a lot about saws. His recommendation on these saws is in the summertime, you're going to start it up. You only need to warm it up at idle for about 30-45 seconds max, and it's good to go. In the wintertime, you suggest that you want to warm it up for about a minute, minute and a quarter, and then you should be good to go. One really important point that you'll see in your manual is how you run the saw in the summer versus the winter. If you're not aware of it, which I wasn't for several years, if you open up the shroud, you're going to find that there's what they call a shutter inside on the right-hand side of the saw. Let's take a look at it. If you're finding in the wintertime that the saw is running really rough, it's highly likely you forgot to flip the shutter around. Because I'll tell you, it is a huge noticeable difference in cold temperatures if you haven't flipped the shutter to its winter position. And whatever you do, don't ever leave that shutter in the winter position when you're running it in the summer. I can't explain exactly mechanically what happens, but according to my guy at the saw shop, you're going to end up with serious engine damage. One of the other topics I get a lot of what I'd say contradictory advice or suggestions from folks on is how to properly spool up the saw when you're about to buck through a log. A lot of folks have told me that being a two-stroke engine, you should never rev it up high unless it's under load. However, your manuals, as well as my guy at the saw shop, and including many of the training videos that I watch on YouTube from whether it's WorkSafe BC or whoever, STIHL, Husqvarna, etc., they always tell you that you don't try to start cutting and spool the saw up to full RPM at the same time. You're supposed to spool it up just before you go into the wood, all the way. That's why I do it. I'd have to say one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the years, always start your day off with a clean, sharp saw. Whew, it's a lot of chain. But I do spend a lot of time watching WorkSafe BC, which is that government organization that oversees the logging industry in British Columbia. There's an Australian channel that has a number of different training videos, whether it's on felling, bucking, or otherwise. STIHL, Echo, Husky, Cottontop. I watch a lot of Buck and Billy Ray Smith. People that I think are professionals or professional loggers, as well as a lot of industry standard training videos that you can find on YouTube. And if you are kind of like me on your property with your chainsaw, I highly recommend you start watching those training videos. They're industry standard videos, whether they're in North America, Australia, Germany. You'll find them from different parts, from different accredited organizations that go through and explain, different types of butt cuts, different types of front cuts when you're falling trees, back cuts. They talk about compression, tension, all kinds of really good information. It's a lot to take in, but over time you slowly start to learn a few things and you try different things that you learn off of those training videos. You got it. GP, you use that chain brake way too often. Well, maybe I do. But I'll tell you, it serves a purpose. Your manual will tell you what that purpose is. But more importantly, if you do start watching some of these standardized industry training videos, you'll notice that the loggers or the people in those training videos always hit that chain brake once they finish a cut and before they start to walk. And as the guys in my saw shop told me, anytime you're not cutting with the saw and it's running, that chain brake needs to be on before you take a step. It's a personal choice, I guess. Wedges. You probably noticed I use them all the time now, far more than I ever have before. It's as a result of watching those chainsaw training videos. Wedges serve a purpose in a lot of different types of cuts, in a lot of different scenarios. And having your wedges with you and at the ready just makes for a better, safer cut. We've always carried wedges, axes, hatchets, etc. out in the forest with us when we're cutting or we're bucking logs or felling trees. The difference, I think, over time is as you're walking through the forest, the trailer starts to get farther and farther and farther away. And if you don't try to carry a bunch of wedges and a hatchet or whatever with you and your chainsaw while you're walking through the forest, you leave them in the trailer. You end up in that position where you're making a butt cut and you realize you could really use a wedge or two because you're under compression. And you look over and that trailer kind of seems too far away. So instead of shutting this off and walking over, getting your wedges, coming back, you get lazy. Oh, that's what my neighbor guy tells me. He's probably right. I am lazy. So what do? You try to finish the cut. Because you're bucking away there and you're making progress. You don't want to slow down and stop. 9 times out of 10, saw gets pinched. So now I carry everything with me. You may recall at the time when I purchased this pouch, I actually had mentioned to you that what I really wanted was a wedge pouch from a company called Weaver Arborist down in the US. So they make a great pouch. It was back ordered, out of stock for months. Well, they finally came into stock and I had to get one. 2 spots for your round files, a couple of spots for flat files or a marker or whatever you need to put in there. Take a look at the design on that belt loop. Nice cutout there if you need to put it between belt loops on your pants. Also much thinner, good, thick, quality hide. Has the loop riveted right on there for your logger's tape. And I can get all 3 of these in this pouch, and I could probably get a 4th in there if I wanted to. So let's talk about something a little more meaty. GP, you buck your logs the wrong way. You're not supposed to position your saw and pivot through your cuts. You're supposed to hold your saw back and cut as level as possible all the way through the log. Well, I gotta tell you, I'm not as strong as outside with Shibe. He's a big guy and he's got big Popeye muscles. I don't. And I can't imagine what it'd be like having to hold the weight of this saw through every butt cut for hours out in the forest. But here's the real reason why I do it. Well, because I used to cut that way. And it's exhausting for a guy like me. I'm not that strong. But more importantly, it's because the manual actually tells you that the proper way of using the chainsaw is to bite your dogs into the side of the log, to use as a fulcrum, and to pivot your saw through the cut, reposition, and pivot through the log. It's right here. It says that you should not be placing the log in the middle or at the end of the bar. because then you get subjected to these types of reactive forces. I believe they call it pushback and pull in. And you saw an example of that on my last video, because I was cutting with the far end of the bar. Do I tend to pivot too far? Probably, but let me show you why. You may recall I used to have a 251. It was a great little saw, but it was a landscape grade saw. 16-inch bar. It was pretty good, but not as powerful, at least anywhere near as powerful as what I've got now. I tended to always have a lot of trouble trying to get through a log, especially anything over about 10-12 inches. It always bogged down quite often in the middle, and that's because I think it just didn't have the power to get through that larger hardwood by itself, despite pivoting or trying to come down horizontal. What I learned over time is if I took the saw and pivoted it down all the way on the front, I basically took out about a third of the amount of wood it would have to cut as I brought it back down more horizontal. And that tended to work a lot better for me, given the fact that the saw itself was no longer having to cut the entire width of the log at once. It already had the first third taken out of it. So coming back down through the log gave it more of a chance of getting through without bogging down or getting caught up and stopping because there was so much debris or chips caught up in the kerf. The other thing I used to do, you might have noticed, is I learned that as I was going through larger logs, I would constantly pull the saw back out to clear the kerf and then go back in. Cut a little bit, pull it out to clear the kerf again out of all the chips and debris, put it back in. So over time, I've just learned that from those earlier days, if I took that first pivot all the way down and cut out a lot of the wood before I started to cut through the rest, the saw tended to find its way through much more efficiently or a little more effectively. It didn't bog down or get pinched as quick. You may also have noticed over the years that both of my mentors, Neighbor Guy and Husky Bob, cut in the same fashion. By the way, I had a little audio trouble in the heat, so you'll notice this is a voiceover, so my lips will not match my words. The reason I always pivot and I dig those dogs in is because if you just try it yourself at home, grab your 462, 261, whatever you've got, hold that saw back and try horizontal cutting one full set of bucks across a 10-foot log. You're now using all your muscles to hold the power of that saw back from trying to pull you into the wood. You're holding it. And like I said, if you got big Popeye muscles, it's probably not a big deal. For me, it's a whole lot less exhausting and in my view safer to lock those dogs in and allow the saw to work under its own power and to remove that weight off of your biceps or your muscles. Because now it's pivoting under its own weight. It's virtually weightless until you pull the saw back out. It works better for me. And hey, I couldn't finish this video out without at least talking a little bit about PPE because I get so many comments over time. And they go from both ends of the spectrum, from you can't have enough PPE to you don't really cut a lot of wood, you're not a logger, you're not out there bucking logs every day of your life, and you're not a professional, you don't need all that equipment. Well, I think it's reasonable to assume that if you do this for a living or you do it every day of the year, that you're exposed to using the equipment, the chainsaws, felling trees, bucking logs. You're exposed to that danger, that risk, more so than I am. For example, we do about 30-35 cord a year. So you could say that as a professional, if you're doing it more often, there's a higher risk of injury. In other words, there's a higher risk of something happening. But I'll leave you this food for thought. The other side of that coin, I think, is if you're learning how to use it, you're not trained, and you don't have that experience or that repetition over years of doing it every day, that maybe you're also exposed to a higher risk of injury because you're not as proficient with the tools or the saw. And that maybe there's even a greater need for folks like us, that maybe that justifies ensuring that you have good quality PPE. Something to think about. Well, I think that just about catches all of the topics, for the most part, that I had written down from all of the comments over the last number of months. I continue to change the way I cut or the way I do things with the saw as I watch more training videos and try to learn new or different styles of bucking wood. For those of you that are kind of like me, I'll leave the links down below in the description of the video, but I strongly recommend that if you're kind of like me with property, you don't have any professional or certified training on a chainsaw or as an arborist or a forester or a logger, WorkSafe BC It's called the BC Faller Training Standards. 17 videos. It's on YouTube. I'll put the link. From Australia, similar type of training called workspace training. And then further, I'd really recommend or suggest that you watch some of the professionals. Buck and Billy Ray Smith, Guilty of Treason, Cottontop. These guys are professionals. And there's a few others out there as well I watch. But I think what you'll find is the more you watch their channels, the more you'll start to pick up on different things they do, or they'll teach you different areas that maybe you haven't thought of yet or you haven't tried yet. Or maybe will make a little more sense to you than what you're currently doing as you're trying to learn on your own. Anyways, I hope it's been kind of helpful today. I really encourage a lot of discussion in the comments below this video because I'd love to hear your suggestions or opinions or advice or your feedback from what you saw today. Thanks for sticking around. It's stinking hot out here, so I'm gonna head home. Have a wonderful weekend with your families. Please be kind to one another, and I'll see you again right here on GP Outdoors. Cheers.